Hello again. I'm Bill Nesmith with First Christian Church, Winchester, Kentucky. It's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue with the overviews of material in the Apocryphal or deuterocanonical material, if you prefer that term, of the Old Testament books. This week's topic is the letter of Jeremiah, which is different from the book of Jeremiah in the traditional Old Testament. This letter opens with a claim that Jeremiah, that is the prophet Jeremiah, sent it to those who were to be taken to Babylon as exiles in order to give them the message God had commanded him to provide them. Which exiles is debated significantly by scholars. However, most would tend to lean in the direction of the first exile, which is in 597 BC. Others would claim no, it's probably the second one in 586 BC, both of those involving Nebuchadnezzar. Or could it be just any Jews in the diaspora at any time? Those are also germane questions that are on the table. What was the message that this Jeremiah letter sends? And I quote, "Because of the sins you have committed before God, you will be taken to Babylon as exiles or prisoners or captives of the king of Nebuchadnezzar. You will remain there a long time, 7 generations. Afterwards, I will bring you away from there in peace. Now, while in Babylon, you will see gods," that's little g, "made of silver, gold, and wood, which cause the pagans to fear. Take care that you do not become like them, and let fear of their gods possess you." End of quote. The writer then, for 73 verses, lays out an extensive, argumentative diatribe, if you will, against idol worship. In fact, the letter is broken into 10 repeats of rehashing of the same argument, but with different words, against idol worship, each time concluding with a refrain that's more or less along this line: "These statues of gods are not real gods, and therefore they should not be feared." This fear idea is not new, but is addressed in the Old Testament book of Jeremiah by the prophet Jeremiah. In fact, it's chapter 10, verses 1 through 16, and I would urge you to read that either before or immediately after you read the letter in order to have good subject text reference, because Isaiah has laid it out there pretty straight. Modern scholars teach that the letter of Jeremiah, that is from the Apocryphal, is essentially probably a later sermon type rewrite of those 16 verses. The writer is using it to address a different situation, but similar to what is described in the story, that would have been experienced by Jews in the diaspora later than this time period. Essentially, it is what exiles of any worshiping Israelite would have faced in a new land outside of Judea, be it Jeremiah's time or any other time. Monotheism was not practiced by others, just the Abrahamic people. Therefore, they should have expected to encounter religions or religious worship services that involve multiple gods, because only they believed in the one God. So this is sound advice, be it whether it comes from Jeremiah or someone else who encounters that kind of religious conflict. In other words, the advice that's given here is, I would say, the following: when in Rome, do not do as the Romans do, is the advice that's being given in counter to what we so often hear taught in the refrain. Multiple God worship was a major threat to the continuation of Israelite Jewish faith, especially when outside their home country of Palestine, Judea. This would have been a common experience in any diaspora Jewish community. Thus, this letter could have fit about any situation in the diaspora and also even in Judea itself during Greco-Roman rules by Assyrians, Greeks, and Romans. Consequently, scholars have greatly debated both the authorship of this letter of Jeremiah and their general consensus that it was written by the prophet. Most feel like that this was written much later than the prophet. The prophet lived in the 6th to 5th century BC, and they think this was written more like 300 years later, because that's about when they see the first evidence other places in history. The credit then was given to Jeremiah because clearly Jeremiah the prophet had identified the problem. And so therefore, even though the advice is expanded significantly, the credit given to Jeremiah. That's the general thinking on authorship. The theological theme is clear. Israel should worship only the God of Scripture, the God of the Hebrew people, the God of the covenant. That is the covenant with the Hebrew people. But this fear issue, what is it all about? Scholars debate it a lot, but generally Israelite people of the Old Testament were taught that God is sovereign and utterly free from influence by man. But scholars say these people were seeing in these other lands very elaborate practices of religion that were designed to influence the gods in an attempt to manipulate the gods to their own wills. Several scholars argue the fear is not to allow such thinking of action to come into the Jewish faith. That would simply not work with the Israel God concept. You are to hear Israel, was their teaching. You are to hear the God of Israel. You're to obey him. You're to worship him and adore him in true loyalty and know he has your needs at his heart. Understand God cannot be their gods, that is the little g's, cannot do good. They cannot really do evil. They can't even take care of themselves. That's the general advice and teaching that's being given here. In reading the letter of Jeremiah in many editions, different editions, you may notice it starts with chapter 6, not chapter 1, verse 1. What's going on here? The New Revised Standard Version has a footnote right after the 6. It reads, and I quote, "The King James Version, like the Latin Vulgate, prints the letter of Jeremiah as chapter 6 of the book of Baruch." By the way, that's the book we talked about last week. And that chapter and verse ordering is here retained. The Greek Bible, on the other hand, have it as a separate letter and not following Baruch. And that's essentially the rationale that's given for why we see this. It was intended to be a book, a chapter in a different book. At least some thinking in that direction. Scholars suspect this letter was initially in Hebrew, but a Hebrew version has not survived. That fragment, there's a fragment of this letter that was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that fragment is also in Greek. The letter of Jeremiah is not considered canon by Jews and Protestants, but it is considered of canon status in Roman Catholic and Orthodox faiths. Also, it's especially praised by the Coptic Christians. The teachings found in the letter of Jeremiah are consistent with Second Temple Judaism and its literature, just like Baruch that we studied last week. It's centered on the commandment, in this case a single commandment, the rejection of graven images of Israel's God or any other God. However, there is much also in this discussion and in this letter. There's implied much degradation of other people's religion. That degradation, consequently, raised a lot of questions with modern readers. Doesn't read the same way today to the minds of today as it might have read 200 or 300, 400 years ago. Since we find ourselves living in a very different world and time, and we may interpret it different. Further thoughts on this question raised in today's world would how your community would think, how the various religions fit in your community, would make for a very good discussion following this. I urge you to study the letter of Jeremiah. It's a good Bible study, and it should provoke considerable thought and discussion as to how this advice would fit in today's time and place.